Guess we're going to start soon. Chris, are you there? Chris is there, but not speaking. Share screen. Okay, so I guess we'll start unless anyone has any pre-starting announcements, which would, I guess, be Chrissa. So we're going to be talking very simply. It's kind of a weird talk, this, because we're going to be talking about a metaphor that underlies not just everything that we do as hypnotists, change workers, coaches. Love the Batman t-shirt, Rick. That is just awesome. I should have worn one. Not just everything that we do as coaches or hypnotists or change workers, but it actually underlies the whole of Western thought. And we're going to be talking about what that metaphor is. And we're going to be talking about an alternative metaphor, which gives us a very different way of thinking about change work in particular. So welcome everyone to the talk, everyone who's here. And I guess as the recording will be out there, everyone watching from home. So we're going to be talking about the rhizome as a metaphor. And in particular, we're going to be talking about what is the rhizome in the context of change work. We're going to be comparing the rhizome metaphor with the metaphor which you probably have embedded in your mind, because it's part of the Western canon of thought, which is the arboreal metaphor. And we're going to be talking about what the characteristics of the rhizome are compared to the arboreal metaphor, i.e. a tree, for those of you who speak Latin. And then to make it specific, I'm going to go through 3 examples of patterns, which progressively move into the world of the rhizome, and you'll see how powerful it is as a metaphor for change work. So the rhizome. Deborah is just entering. Hi, Deborah, if you can hear me. So we're talking about the rhizome. So where is all this stuff from? Well, the rhizome was first raised as a metaphor. I'll tell you what the rhizome is in a second, if you don't know. But the rhizome was first raised as a metaphor for the mind by Carl Jung. He said, the rhizome's a much better metaphor for the brain than anything else that we've got. It was then taken by a couple of philosophers, I guess, Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. I guess they're French-ish, if you want to read more about it, but their work is very, very dense, so I wouldn't advise it unless you're like really keen to dive into dense philosophical work. It was then taken by my teacher, our teacher, John Overdurf, who really turned it into an underlying pattern for change work. So a lot of the stuff I'll be talking about, I'm going to give credit to John Overdurf for. In particular, the rhizomatic pattern, which we'll be talking about, which is called the Rhizomatic Shape Shifter. That's the official name of the pattern. That is John Overdurf. So credit to John. I'm also going to we'll talk about a couple of other people as well in terms of like why the rhizome. So Gilles, who was one of the developers of the rhizome as a metaphor, made an interesting quote. And what he said was, in truth, Freud sees nothing and understands nothing. Sigmund Freud. So what is he talking about there? He's talking about Freud's ideas that everything you experience now in the moment arises from things in your past, right? I as a man wanted to have sex with my mother and therefore wanted to kill my father, and that gives me problems now. This is not actually true. And my problems now are caused by that thing in my past, right? So it's that idea of cause and effect. And that's why Gilles Deleuze said, in truth, Freud sees nothing and understands nothing because of this cause and effect. So why are we interested in metaphors which simply underlie our work? So obviously we use metaphor with our clients, right? We'll say, okay, this is like climbing a mountain, or this is like surfing, or whatever metaphor makes sense for them. But we have certain metaphors that actually underlie our process. And the simplest one probably to think about, one that you've probably all gone through in terms of structuring your practice, is what do you call yourself? So do you call yourself a hypnotist? Do you call yourself a hypnotherapist? Do you call yourself a coach? Or do you call yourself something else entirely? If you call yourself a hypnotherapist, that implies to the wider world, and possibly to yourself as well, that you're in the business of fixing people, right? Therapy means somebody comes to you who is broken, psychologically, emotionally broken, and you have to fix them. Versus if you call yourself a coach, probably the clients who come and see you are more into like, well, I want that goal over there. Can you help me to achieve it? Right. So simply the underlying metaphor based upon what you call yourself. Are you a therapist who's fixing people who have some problem? Or are you a coach who's leading somebody in the right direction? These are going to give you very different stream of people. It's like I feel like I'm in a Lewis Carroll poem or something. That's a metaphor. It gives you a very different type of person who may be attracted to your practice, and maybe for yourself as well, you would approach things in a different way. So that's the power of metaphors. And metaphors are really their underlying assumptions. CC, Mind Mastery Coaching. That is completely awesome. Isaac Asimov, who was a big science thinker, science fiction writer, said this. He said, assumptions are your window on the world, and you need to scrub them off occasionally, otherwise the light won't come in. So what does that mean? That means that if you have a metaphor which you apply to the world, it's like you're looking through a window using that metaphor. And that metaphor only lets in certain types of light, right, depending on the metaphor. So this talk is really your opportunity to reevaluate the metaphor that you have on life, or in particular on change work, and maybe to try another one, which is the rhizome. Albert Einstein said, he was a physicist, I believe, said, logic can take you from point A to point B, but imagination can take you anywhere that you want. Right, so that is going to become a very key idea when we talk about the two metaphors, the arboreal and the rhizomatic way of viewing the world, excuse me, viewing change work. Okay, are we going from A to B, or are we going anywhere that we want to go to? Hopefully that makes sense. So somebody can, I don't know if anyone can answer the questions. Yes, this is drawn from the work of Deleuze in a very indirect way. So just to repeat, started with Carl Jung, went to Deleuze, and this is really based on the work of John Overdurf. But yeah, it's the work of Deleuze does form a platform for this. So before we dive into the rhizome, let's talk about what the model is, which you probably use now, not just in terms of your change work, but in terms of thinking about the world, because it's the ultimate foundation of the Western way of thinking about things. And that is as a tree. So what is a tree? Well, you plant a seed, you get an acorn or whatever the tree seed is. You plant it, and the acorn does two things. It sends out a shoot, which becomes the branch of the tree, and it sends down a taproot. And the trunk of the tree, the shoot, turns into the trunk of the tree, which then spreads branches. And then those branches may also spread sub-branches, and those sub-branches may spread twigs and the twigs, leaves, etc. But it's branching out. Each time it comes to a junction, it splits into two or more pathways and then branches out from there. And this is the way that we organize our thoughts in the Western world generally, right? So if you think about, I don't know, a family tree or family, right? You think, well, we have the parents, we have the children, we have the grandchildren, we have the great-grandchildren, we have the grandparents, right? So it's like a tree, depending on where you start. It branches downwards to the descendants and it branches upwards to the ancestors. If you work in a company, right, and you look at the company organizational chart, it's going to look something like a tree or an upside down tree, right? You'll have the CEO at the top, and then you'll have the C-suite executives, the CFO, and all the rest of those guys. And then under the CFO, there'll be the financial controller and so on and so forth. So it looks like a tree. Everyone reports up through a straight line to the top of the tree. If you think about how we organize information, if you go to a library, they use the Dewey Decimal system. I believe they still do. I don't, maybe it's changed, but they used to in my day. And that again is like a tree, right? It splits into different types of knowledge, right? So there'll be science, humanities, fiction. In science, there'll be physics, chemistry, biology. So all the information is organized like this expanding tree. If you think about the science of evolution, right? It's a tree. They come down and they reach a branch and it splits and it splits and it splits and it splits and it looks like an upside down tree. Most anything that we do in the Western world, right? We organize the information so that it looks like a tree. And we're so used to this. It's so ingrained in how we think about things that we don't really think about the alternatives. But now we will, because we're talking about the rhizome. So a tree. Everything, the branches come out of the trunk, the sub-branches come from the branches, the twigs from the sub-branches, the leaves from the twigs, and so on. If you cut off a branch of the tree, that's it. That branch is gone. It's no longer part of the tree. If you want to get from, let's say, a leaf to a root within the tree, you have to follow the leaf to the twig to the sub-branch, the sub-branch to the branch to the trunk down to the taproot, and then you have to follow it to the particular root, right? So you have to trace the structure of the tree to go from A to B. That's sort of how a tree is organized. All right, and everyone's there like, okay, well, isn't that how things actually work, right? Because as hypnotists, if you have a client, maybe your client comes in and say, oh, I have this problem, right? And you say, oh, well, let's do a re-imprinting. Let's go back to childhood, right, and find out where that problem comes from, right? So we'll use the affect bridge. Like, what does it feel like when you're in that problem? And we'll take that feeling and we'll use it to bridge back to a prior time and a prior time and a prior time and a prior time until we find the first time, right? The ISE, when you felt that, the first time you felt that feeling, right? And then we will change that event. We'll make some changes there. And then those changes are then going to come forward in time and change how you feel now. Right? So that presupposes that how they are now came from that first event. And the way to fix it is to go back to that first event and do a re-imprinting, right? Put more resources in there or whatever we have to do to change that original experience, that ISE for the client. Right, so this is a linear, it's kind of like a tree. That first event came through their timeline and branched as they had more experiences until they find themselves now with that with the result of that seed that was planted at the ISE. So in a lot of the patterns of classical hypnosis, it's got this tree feeling, this linear cause and effect type of feeling. Okay, so what is a rhizome, you may ask? Some of you may know, some of you may be gardeners. Some of you may have looked it up. Some of you may not know. So I am speaking to the people who don't know in the audience here and in the audience at home. A rhizome is a plant, but it's a plant. The probably best known example is the bamboo plant. And you may say, well, you see a bamboo plant and it's like just like a stick that comes out of the ground. But actually, that's not the bamboo plant, right? The bamboo plant is under the ground and is a network of interconnected, let's call them roots, but they're not from a tap root. It's like a web of roots. And what you see in the bamboo forest are simply shoots which are coming up from that underlying plant. That's not the bamboo plant itself. It's simply a shoot that is coming up out of this underground structure. So in order to begin to use the rhizome, both in the way you think about the world or especially in terms of change work, we need to think about what the characteristics of the rhizome are compared to a tree, right? If the tree is our current metaphor, we need to compare and contrast the rhizome. So what are the characteristics of a rhizome? Well, the first one is the rhizome is looking for connection. Right? It's not growing in a linear branching fashion. It's looking to connect with other parts of the rhizome all the time. Right? So it's always seeking to make a connection. And we'll get on in a second as to what these principles mean in terms of change work. It's got a principle that any point in the rhizome is connected to any other point in all sorts of ways, right? So you don't need to go back to the trunk, back to the taproot. There's all sorts of pathways to get, if you take 2 points in the rhizome, in the underlying plant structure, you can find all sorts of ways to get from one to the other, right? So all the points are connected up. It's got a characteristic which they call multiplicity. That means that it's a complex structure, the rhizome, right? It's complicated, it's got all these branches and connections, but it didn't come from a prior structure, right? So it's not like a tree where you plant the acorn and you know it's going to come up with a shoot which will turn into the trunk and a taproot down and branch out, and you can say, oh, that's an oak tree, I recognize the shape, right? It's not like that. It's a complex structure and you cannot point to something in the past that caused it. It's just too complicated to do that. There's a characteristic, it's got a weird name, it's called a signifying rupture. And all that really means is if you rupture the plant, if you break the rhizome, right? Like you cut up the branch off a tree, branch falls off, it's not part of the tree anymore. But if you cut into a rhizome, the rhizome just starts to grow again. Right? It may grow into something that looks like the old rhizome, but it may grow into something entirely different, entirely new. Right? But it doesn't like cut and that's it. It regrows in some way. And finally, a rhizome is like a map. It's not like a structure. Like, okay, I've got this structure and it looks like X, right? It's not like that. It's like a map. It's like the map of a city, right? You don't have necessarily straight lines and blocks. There could be roads that wander around. It's like a map of London versus a map of Midtown Manhattan, which is all in squares. So what do these characteristics mean in terms of change work? What are the implications for our change work? Once we've gone through these, then we'll talk about some examples of pieces of change work. based on the arboreal versus based on the rhizome, so that you'll have a sort of a practical application, I hope, at least. So the first of the characteristics we said is the fact that the rhizome seeks to make connections, right? It seeks to link things up. Well, guess what? So do your clients. So if your client comes in with a problem, right? They say, oh, I don't know, my client is Kevin, and he comes in and he says, oh, I've got a fear of speaking in public, right? That's my problem. Now we could, if we were in the arboreal type of model, say, well, let's go back to the ISE, which is, you know, he was in show and tell or whatever. That was the cause of his fear of speaking in public now, right? The rhizome, you could say, well, what's the connection between your fear of speaking in public and your love of ice cream? And Kevin would go, that's interesting that you should say that, right? Because simply by asking the question, by lighting up the circuit which says fear of speaking in public at the same time as the circuit that says I love ice cream, they automatically seek to connect to each other, right? So Kevin is going to tell me now that there's a connection between his love of ice cream and his fear of speaking in public. That's the way the human brain works. So the second one is that every point in the rhizome is connected, has a connection to other points in the rhizome. And that means that if we light up both parts of the rhizome, meaning both the circuits within the client's brain, and we change one part, it will automatically change the second part. That's just how the rhizome works, how the rhizomatic brain works. So if we light up Kevin's fear of speaking in public and we light up his love of strawberry ice cream, and we transfer that and we make it a love of banana ice cream, this is not like a wild example. I'm not suggesting you do this as a piece of change work. But if you did, if you change this from strawberry to banana, his love of ice cream, it would change his fear of speaking in public. I know, bizarre, right? It is bizarre, but it's actually true. In fact, if anyone is interested, I could give you a little exercise to do with your clients or your classes, but we won't do that yet. So the third principle, right, is the principle of multiplicity, which says that the client now, Kevin, with his fear of speaking in public, is not the result of the ISE. It's not the result of him, his bad experience when he was doing show and tell at the age of 6. That is connected. It's an influence. If we change that, it will change his current experience. But Kevin now, including his fear of speaking in public, is the sum total of all his experiences. Not just from the past, but also from the present. And not just from the past and the present, but also from the future. Right? Kevin's experiences or expectations, let's say, of the future are going to impact upon his experience now of his fear of speaking in public, as well as how he's feeling now, what he's seeing now, what he's paying attention to now, things that took place in his past, things that he thought took place in his past. So his present state is the sum total of all these experiences, all these perceptual positions. Right, so not just now, not just then, not just in the future, but also now from the perspective of somebody else, from the perspective perhaps of the audience, right? This is a fear of speaking in public. All these things combined make him what he is right now. And we can change any one of them, and that will change his current experience. That's number 3. We have 5, right? The fourth one is this one, a signifying rupture, which basically means when you cut the rhizome, it's going to grow. It's going to grow into either something that looks the same or something that looks entirely different. Meaning that when Kevin comes to see me with his fear of speaking in public, and we do a piece of change work together, right? We change the perceptual positions, all this influence from the past, the future, other people's perspective, what he's feeling, what he's hearing, what he's seeing, all these things, we change something and it changes, it cuts his fear of speaking in public off. The rhizome is going to regrow, right? We've taken something away. The rhizome, which is his brain, his mind, is going to regrow that in some way, so that it is incumbent upon us as change workers not simply to help him get rid of the problem, blow out the problem, but also to provide guidance as to how the rhizome should regrow. Right. So, for example, I always say to my client, hey, piece of change work is not over until at the earliest the next day, the following morning after you've slept and dreamt. Because when you sleep and dream, your brain is going to make all sorts of connections and learnings, right? So we want to project the change into Kevin's future in a positive way, so that not only did we get rid of the problem, but the rhizome is going to regrow, and not just where he has a sense of confidence or a sense of freedom in front of an audience, but it's going to regrow in all sorts of unexpected ways. In the HNLP world, which is my sort of school of change work, we say you never know how far a change may go. You've cut the rhizome off, it's going to regrow, and you never know how far those changes are going to take Kevin in the future. And we need to, as far as possible, lay a positive direction for those changes to take place. Okay, so I wanted to give you a real example, because we've been kind of abstract. I tried to give you some flesh, but I want to talk about a real example. So we'll see how my tech is. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Chris says she's in the Zoom room. Okay, I don't know what that means. Okay, can you see my screen? Yes. Okay, people are saying yes. Shawn, we can see it. So this is just like a little picture which I did. I'm just going to close this window down, which shows sort of like a diagrammatic representation of re-imprinting, right? In the classical sense. So essentially, your client's on the right-hand side in the future of the timeline. The present of the timeline, they come into your office, they're in a red state, a problem state. Kevin comes in and says, I've got a fear of speaking in public, right? We get that fear and we use that fear to, as part of the affect bridge, to take him back to this time in the past, which is on the left-hand side of the screen, which in this case is show and tell. He's 6 years old, he's in show and tell, and he had an awful time for whatever reason, right? So Kevin is now looking at that ISE, right? Kevin is dissociated generally in re-imprinting, right? So he's looking down at that scene in some way, shape, or form, and he's sending resources down, right, to re-resource the younger Kevin or the other people in the scene or whatever your methodology for doing a re-imprinting is. Right? So it's pretty simple. You know, it's effective. I'm not saying it's not. But a couple of things to notice, or the big thing to notice, is that in the pattern, once we've got the ISE, Kevin is dissociated, taking a look at it, is he is looking at that event, right? So he is essentially in foveal vision. He's paying attention to that event in his past, show and tell. So he's pretty much in foveal vision. Right? He's focused down on that. And the reason he's focused down on that is because that ISE led him to his current issue, right? That was the seed that grew into the tree, which he has now, which is his fear of speaking in public. So that's the basic pattern. There we go. Now, I wanted to compare and contrast that with the NLP fast phobia cure, sometimes called VK dissociation, because we're not supposed to use the word phobia. It's a medical condition. So in this case, we add a couple of things in, right? We typically not just go back to that scene, but we go back to a time immediately before the scene when the client felt safe, when Kevin felt safe. And then we add a scene immediately after the show and tell, immediately after the ISE, right? When Kevin felt safe again. And just for the sake of argument, we use a double dissociation if we're using the theater technique. So Kevin is in the projection room, watching himself in the cinema or watching himself on the screen. So it's a double dissociation. You might send resources down. You might change submodalities. So you might say something like, so you're in the projection room watching yourself in the theater, watching the movie, and it's one of those old black and white movies, right? The sorts of movies that nobody ever watches anymore. So you've taken the color out of the movie, as well as double dissociating, so that you've probably robbed the movie of even more of its emotional content. And you're sending resources down, doing submodality shifts. You're putting in perhaps a circus music is the traditional NLP approach. And then we're going to actually change the direction of time. So we will run the movie backwards from the safe position immediately after the event to the safe position immediately before the event, and not only backwards, but probably super fast as well. So we've put in, from the NLP perspective, all these other things, submodalities, backwards rather than forwards, safe place to safe place. The reason we do safe place to safe place is because we know safe place, there's no charge on it. Safe place, there's no charge on it. So that when they go through the emotional roller coaster of the event, it always goes from 0 to 0, and that tends to take the charge out over time. So that's how it's different. We put a lot more things in there than maybe just a classical re-imprinting. But what I want to point out is we're still in this model of cause and effect, of moving through time, a foveal vision. You're focusing down on this small piece of time where you go safe, ISE, safe, right? So you're very much focused down on that event, right? It's the safe place that immediately pre something or other that comes immediately before the ISE, and the safe place that comes immediately after the ISE. So we're still focused down on that small piece of time, and we're still in the metaphor that it was that ISE, that seed, that acorn that was planted in our past that grew up into the tree now. And that's what we need to change. So I guess, let me just check in, see if there's any questions. Oh, where is everybody gone? Stop sharing. Okay. There I am again. So just wanted to make sure that everyone was kind of somewhat familiar with the re-imprinting, maybe with the NLP fast phobia cure, or if anyone is lost or has a question or anything on that before we go on to the Rhizomatic version, which is John Overdurf's Rhizomatic Shape Shifter. I don't see anyone asking anything, so I will assume that everyone is good. No. Okay. Desktop. Oh, okay. Can you see my screen? Okay. Tech. I am so good at tech. I'm just like, oh, there we go. Is that better? I think we're okay. I hope we are okay. Right. So now we are going to move on to the. Oh, I left the title the same. I do apologize. This should say the Rhizomatic Shape Shifter. Copyright John Overdurf. I will fix that before I put the slides in the group. So this is the Rhizomatic version of the same pattern. So bear in mind, the rhizome says everything is connected. If you change anything, you change everything, or at least everything, all the mental circuits which are lit up at that time. And the problem state obviously is going to be lit up because that's what your client comes in and talks about. But it's not just the ISE, changing the ISE. You can make a change anywhere on the timeline, anywhere in the client's current experience, their preferred flavor of ice cream, and it's going to change everything else which is lit up at that time. Oh, somebody needs to be admitted. Chrissa. No, Chrissa is bouncing in and out like a rubber ball. That's okay. So let me just walk through what the Rhizomatic Shape Shifter is. And again, I do apologize for the title. So we embed the NLP fast phobia cure, VK dissociation, right? So there's, well, let's step back from that and say, first of all, within the rhizomatic model metaphor, there is no such thing as an ISE, right? There is no original cause for the problem the client has now, right? So we might go back, like if the client says, well, I know where this came from. It came from this time I was 6 years old and it was show and tell. We might go to some other event where they were making a presentation in public or speaking in public. But we could also go back to some event which seems unconnected to talking in public. Why? Because if that's where the client goes to, they are telling you the rhizome connects their current fear of speaking in public with that event. So the red figure in the middle could be anything, anytime, any event. Maybe the ISE, may not be the ISE. It may be something that doesn't seem like it's got anything to do with presenting in public. And as long as the client's rhizome has connected those two things up, that's enough, right? We can, we typically in the HNLP map, we do a triple dissociation. So we actually see the event on a screen. We have the screen on a cell phone so that it's small, and then we put the cell phone down on the ground far away, or as far away as necessary. So that's sort of like a triple dissociation, but that's by the by. We'll again be doing submodality shifts. We'll be sending resources to the younger Kevin in the picture in the movie. So the same as the VK dissociation. We have safe to safe, because that's a great way of running the movie. But now we're going to say, hey, it's not about that, right? The rhizome is not about that event. It's not about safe, ISE, safe, or safe event, safe. It's much, much more than that, right? So it's also about, for example, how the client is feeling, what the client is doing, what control the client has in the present over the process. So that, for example, we might lead the client into heart breathing whilst they're in the process or before they start the process, so that they have emotional control, let's say, over their body whilst they're in the process, because that's also going to shift the experience. We'll also take perhaps a time much, much earlier than this event, right? A happy time from their childhood. And we'll get them to see that. So, something which has no connection either to the ISE or to the fear of speaking in public now, just some earlier event, much earlier. And then we'll take some point in the future, right? It says future self, end state energy, some point in the future where they are so over this issue, so far over this issue, they don't even remember why it was ever an issue. Right? And how are they feeling then when they've stepped into their ideal future and they're living the life they want to live, right? What's that energy? So now I've got a timeline which is much, much longer than either re-imprinting or the fast phobia cure, right? I've got a timeline that spreads not just from way in their past to the present, but way in their past to the future. And I am going to invite them to see this whole thing in peripheral vision. So peripheral vision basically means, well, we'll talk about that in a second, but you know, peripheral vision means seeing everything at the same time, right? Being able to see the whole landscape at the same time. And this is also a physiological marker of parasympathetic, i.e. rest and digest, feeling peaceful, right? So they're going to see this whole scene in peripheral vision. We might associate them into, let's say, the future self with the end state energy, and they can look into the future from there and say, wow, I'm just feeling fantastic and my future is unlimited. Or from that position, they could look back into the past and say, oh, this issue I used to have is nothing now, right? Similarly, you could reassociate them into their very early self, right? And look forward, or look back into the womb if you want to, right? So they can be in any part of the timeline, looking to the future, to the past, in whichever direction they wish to look, and indeed multiple directions. And obviously they can look at the situation from the eyes of other people, from the eyes of the audience, and so on and so forth, as in a standard re-imprinting or a piece of change work. So that we'll just talk about within the context of this Rhizomatic Shape Shifter pattern. I apologize for the title. The title is not correct. Copyright John Overdurf. We're taking multiple aspects, and I'm not saying these are the only ones that you could use, but we're taking multiple aspects of the client's experience in the moment, in their own body, in the future, looking towards the future, in the future, looking towards the present, in the future, looking towards the past, right? In the safe space, way in the past, from another person's perspective, and we're combining all of those into one greater experience where all these things are lit up within the rhizome and they all start to interact. And then we're going to just run this whole experience from the future, from their future self, with their end state energy feeling free or whatever they're feeling, way back to this very early state. Obviously, you would do this with a client who didn't have a lot of issues in their past. And we are going to run that whole thing backwards. Right? So it's not just from the safe place immediately after the experience to the safe place immediately before the experience, which might be, 10 minutes or whatever. This is being run backwards over years and years and years of their life, so that this experience which we are changing becomes just one tiny dot in this whole rewinding. We rewind obviously multiple times. So I'll give you a second just to consider this. I'll put these slides up on the group, and I will change the title if I remember. I'm just going to stop the share there. So just to sort of restate this idea of peripheral vision, if some people are not familiar with that. So foveal vision means you are focused down on a point, and foveal vision is used in fight or flight. So you're a caveman, you're walking through the forest. Oh, I guess you're walking through the cave, I don't know. The cave's in the forest. So you're a caveman, you're walking through the forest and you see the saber-toothed tiger, or let's go velociraptor. You see the velociraptor, right? And you go like, oh, threat, right? And you go into foveal vision. In fact, you go into tunnel vision because there's the threat, and your body goes into sympathetic, fight or flight, right? Do I fight the velociraptor or do I run from the velociraptor? Both of those choices are pretty bad because velociraptors have big jaws and long legs. So I don't know what you would do, but foveal vision, right? Don't be concerned, because in spite of what Jurassic Park says, velociraptors and people were not around at the same time. So that was just a metaphor, just saying, right? Versus peripheral vision, right? You're walking through the forest, you're the caveman, you come out of your cave, you're walking through the forest, and you're sort of like open. You're kind of going like, oh, isn't it a nice day? I better like have a look to see if there's any fruit in the trees, right? So you're in this open view where you're looking for opportunities. So that's in a parasympathetic rest and digest type of state, although you haven't found the apple yet, so it's not digest, but you're in a peaceful state. So it's very difficult to be in a problem state, or the typical problems which our client brings, they'll be in foveal, right? So the simple act of teaching them how to go into peripheral vision, so we typically say, hey, hold up your fingers. Why doesn't everybody hold up your fingers? We're teaching you now how to go into peripheral vision for those signing in from home, right? And you spread your hands out and be aware that you can see the wiggling or the waggling or whatever of your fingers as you move your hands out, right? As you do that, as you see both your hands at the same time, that is peripheral vision. And so it's always a good idea to teach your clients how to do that. Come back to normal focus. Back to normal focus, right? So they get used to going into that, because it's very hard to maintain a problem if you're in the sort of problem which our clients normally bring if you're in the peripheral vision. So that's a great thing to teach your client. And the joy of this pattern is that you invite them to see their timeline, right, with this early them, this future them who's really resourceful, as well as this past event, safe to safe, and see it all at the same time, which means they will automatically be in peripheral vision. And doing that, because the visual sense is 50% of your brain, right? 50% of your brain generally is devoted to visual processing. And when you imagine seeing something in front of you, it lights up all that visual stuff. So that in terms of neurons going into peripheral vision and seeing all these things allows them to interact within the rhizome, right? So it allows all these changes to take place no matter which direction, no matter whether it's from their hearts, from heart breathing into this whole thing, or from their future self, or from being associated into their future self and looking back or looking forward, whichever, let's say, perceptual position these things are, it allows them all to interact and all to begin to change, shake up and change this this issue, this ISE, or the issue as they experience it now, as Kevin experiences it now. So I hope that's kind of given you some idea. This is not, we're not saying like only change their taste and flavor of ice cream. We're not saying don't use the ISE. We're just saying that there's a lot more pieces to the puzzle that you can use. So that if you say, well, I'm just going to do an ISE, I'm just going to do a regression to cause and a re-imprinting on the ISE, and it works, fantastic, right? But if it doesn't work, there are a million other pieces that you can add into that on a cumulative basis, which will give the client even more opportunity to grow the rhizome in a new way, to add new resources. So basically the question is, what is a resource in terms of change work? And under the classical model, you typically think of a resource as being something which is appropriate to solve the problem. So very often a resource is what's the opposite, right? So if the client has a fear of speaking in public, maybe you say, well, obviously the resource should be confidence because it's the opposite. The rhizomatic map basically says a resource is anything that is not part of the neural network of the problem right now. Right, so that could be their future self, it could be their past self, it could be heart breathing, it could be peripheral vision, it could be banana flavored ice cream, it can be anything which is not part of the problem right now, if that makes sense. So the rhizomatic map gives you a lot more choices as to what the quote unquote resources are that you will use with your client, or that you could use with your client. It gives you unlimited options as to what those resources could be, and they could be completely unexpected, right? Could be something completely out of the blue. So I just want to, I don't want to finish with this, but I do want to say, if you trained with Steve Gilligan, right, and you've gone like, what the fuck is Steve Gilligan doing, right? Because he's completely off the charts. The client has some issue, and Steve Gilligan is taking him on some journey to, I don't know, the back cave or something. And you go like, what's that got to do with this? Well, the reason that has got something to do with this is because both those circuits are lit up at the same time and they're connected via the rhizome. So it gives you insight into that kind of weird change work that you'll see from Gilligan or somebody like that. So that's kind of the outline of the rhizome metaphor. And I hope I gave you some insight into application in a piece of change work, i.e. re-imprinting versus Rhizomatic Shape Shifter. And let me just finish off. I've got some notes here, so I'm just reading off my notes. That's all I'm doing, just reading. That's not true. Ad-libbing as well. So just to finish off, I'm not suggesting for a moment that you abandon the arboreal cause and effect type of metaphor in terms of doing change work. What that gives you is a really tight piece of change work, right? Client's got a problem, Kevin comes in with a problem, and you're going to do something that is very specifically tied to the problem, you know, be that a regression to cause or whatever it might be, but it's going to be cheek by jowl. I think that means this, cheek by jowl with the problem, right? You're only looking at things which are really connected to the problem. And that's fine if you get the piece of change work. If you want to have more options, if your arboreal approach isn't working with your clients, if you want to have more fun, if you want to have more playfulness in your sessions, then the rhizomatic metaphor, I think, opens up a lot of options. So it allows you to choose anything as a resource that's not currently part of the problem. It allows you to be playful and bring in things which are fun for you and your client. It allows you to use metaphors which have nothing to do with the problem, right? Some people will say, well, I've got this client, like what metaphor should I use for this client? Well, the rhizome says the metaphor can be anything. Right? You can tell your client a story about anything that your unconscious mind chooses to shoot up or down, either up from the lungs or down from the unconscious mind to your lips and out of your lips, right? Because any metaphor, any story that you tell your client's rhizome, i.e. their mind, their brain or whatever, is going to connect to their problem and is going to make meaning from, and it's going to change their problem because it's brought in new information into that neural network, into their problem landscape. So it gives you an infinite number of ways of approaching change work when you say, okay, I believe it's, who said that? Was it like Peter Pan or something? I believe in the rhizome, right? When you accept the rhizome as a model for the brain, which it is, right? If you think about it, right? If you were to get your client and actually cut their head open, I'm joking, don't do this. That was just a joke. But if you did, you would see their brain and you would see it looks like a rhizome, right? It looks like a mess of interconnected roots and shoots and stuff. It doesn't look like a tree, right? If you take somebody's brain out, it doesn't look like a tree. It looks like a interconnected ball of wool or something, right? So all you have to do is to accept and believe in the rhizome, and it gives you an infinite world of possibilities of how to do your change work, unlimited. So that's all I've got time for, and anyway, that's all I wanted to say. If anyone has any questions, either now or in the future, feel free to post in the group or whatever, or you can message me or whatever, and ask your question, and I will do my best to give you an answer. I can't guarantee the answer will make sense, but I'll give you some kind of an answer.
Thank you so much.
So if there's nothing else, Charles's wife is asleep. Is it being recorded? Yeah, I think it should be recorded on the group. But if not, I've got my recording on, so I can work and find a way to post it on the group. And I think that is about it in terms of the chat. So with that, I bid you a fond adieu. Bear in mind that you are in the greatest place on the face of the planet right now, whatever that might be, wherever that might be. I myself am in New York, which is the greatest city on the face of the earth, because I live here, and it's almost margarita time, which is a wonderful time in New York. So good night, everyone. Bear in mind that when you sleep and dream, you will fully and completely absorb all the information I just gave you. All right.